Thank you so much, Rachel, and welcome to everyone who has signed up for today's webinar on the future of V2X. ITS America, we're a community that represents stakeholders across the transportation industry, and our organization's mission is to advance the development and deployment of technology to make the transportation system safer, greener, and smarter. Um, V2X technologies continue to be a key pillar of realizing that vision for the transportation system. And we start with safety. And before we sort of went into this global pandemic that has claimed hundreds of thousands of American lives, millions of lives across the world, we were losing about 36,000 people a year on American base. And once this pandemic is over, we're going to have to go back to dealing with that epidemic of roadway deaths. Um, V2X technologies, we believe, is the best tool in our toolbox to reduce the crashes that cause the majority of those fatalities. In addition, there's a real focus right now on sustainability in the carbon footprint of the U.S. transportation sector, and V2X technologies are critical to reducing congestion and the associated emissions that come along with that. So for the past couple of years, America has been the tip of the spear in the fight with the FCC, to preserve the full 75 megahertz for critical V2X communications. The FCC has advanced a rulemaking that would reallocate 45 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 band away from V2X technologies, limiting V2X to 30 megahertz of remaining spectrum in the band. Yes, America strongly believes that we should have 75 megahertz for V2X technologies, because we believe that in the future, that band, that bandwidth will be needed to meet the demand of all of the vehicles and all of the traffic in that spectrum. In addition, we have great concerns that the 30 megahertz that has been left for V2X technologies is not properly shielded, and that out-of-band emissions will likely interfere with safety critical messages. So we are continuing the fight for the full 75. But when I was the Secretary of Transportation in Delaware, it was used to say, and some others have said this as well, that we for the best and we prepare for the worst. And our scenario here is that this will move forward. And if we are left with 30 megahertz, we have to decide how can we make this work and what would work there. And so we established a future of V2X working group to evaluate the impact of the FCC's proposals and which message types and applications would and would not likely be deployable in a 30 megahertz environment. Some of that working group's work will be presented today in the form of an applications map. And while that map shows that some V2X applications can still be deployed, we will likely lose the opportunity to deploy more advanced V2X applications that allow for cooperative and coordinated movement and protection of vulnerable road users, such as pedestrians and bicyclists. These lost applications are very important to the connectivity of automated vehicles as well. Without these applications, we will certainly not be able to achieve the safety benefits that we could otherwise. So this very preliminary starting point for discussions. We look forward to continuing this conversation. And look, I know that there are folks out there who are like, you should just focus on saving the full 75 and not talk about making the 30 work. There are folks out there who are like, forget about saving the 75 and just focus on making the 30 work. This is what happens when you have an association like ours that is a big, passionate membership. But we are just trying to do what is right and what we believe is best. I want to thank ITS America's Future of V2X Working Group for the work that they have done over the last several months. And I also want to thank our presenters today from Cisco, Qualcomm, and Toyota. So we look forward to continuing the conversation, and hopefully we end up in a full 75 megahertz environment. And this is just the basis for future work. But if the opposite comes true, we do want to be able to say that we're working to advance the conversation. So I'll now turn it over to Tim Drake, Vice President of Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs. Tim?
Thank you, Shaylin, for those opening remarks. Give a quick overview of the webinar today. You will hear from myself. I'll provide a summary of the working group's efforts and the application map from Mark Nellinger at Cisco, who will provide a little bit more information about the basis for the evaluation of applications and spectrum usage for the application map. From Jim Meisner from Qualcomm Technologies, who will help us understand and give us a little more insight into how C-V2X could be deployed in a 30 megahertz scenario. And also John Kenny from Toyota with some additional thoughts on a 30 megahertz environment and how we should proceed as we seek to develop consensus around that environment. And then, as mentioned previously, we are hoping there will be some time left for questions at the end of the webinar. So please put those in the question and answer box throughout the webinar. Next slide. So I'm going to start with a little background on where we are today. So the FCC proposed early last year, as most or all of you know, to reallocate the lower 45 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for unlicensed devices and away from V2X technologies. Their proposal would leave only 30 megahertz for V2X technologies, the upper 30 megahertz, and also would require all V2X technologies to transition to using C-V2X technology. The FCC took the step of approving this action in November at its November meeting in 2020, although we're still awaiting the final report and order, publication of the final report and order in the Federal Register. Along with the final RNO, we expect a further notice of proposed rulemaking to be published, and that includes many important issues that we will also continue to work on and submit comments and reply comments on. And those issues related to the transition timeline, potential for reimbursement for incumbent users in the lower 45, as well as power limits for outdoor unlicensed devices. Next slide. ITS America, I think, took a strong opposition stance to the FCC's proposal. We worked with stakeholders throughout the industry to submit comments and reply comments and hold events and evaluate the proposal and really try to communicate the impact it would have on V2X technologies. We certainly believe that the full 75 megahertz is needed for transportation communications, both the applications that exist today and also applications that we can see right around the corner coming down the road. Our main problems with the proposal is, one, it doesn't leave enough spectrum for V2X technologies and for us to fully realize the benefits that those technologies can provide from a safety and economic and an environmental perspective. And additionally, as Shaylin mentioned in his opening remarks, we also think the FCC's proposal does not adequately protect the remaining 30 megahertz from out-of-band interference that could impact V2X technologies that are deployed. Next slide. Due to the FCC's actions and the proposal that they put forward, ITS America convened a Future of V2X working group. And this was to evaluate the expected impacts of the proposal and included members of ITS America representing infrastructure owner-operators, automotive manufacturers, and technology companies. I think having all of these viewpoints in the same room as we discussed this topic was important and will be important going forward to build any sort of consensus on how to continue to develop and deploy V2X technologies, particularly should the FCC's proposal advance. One priority task for the Future of V2X working group was to identify what message types and associated applications would likely be deployed in a 30 megahertz scenario, and which message types and applications would likely be lost. The purpose of this is twofold. One is to demonstrate the negative impact that the FCC's proposal will have on transportation safety, to identify the types of applications and benefits that we won't realize if we're limited to a 30 megahertz environment. And the other is to identify a path forward. So we believe that we still need to actively seek to develop and deploy V2X technologies in a safe way and to get as many benefits as we can should the FCC continue with its reallocation proposal. Next slide. So about the application map, the Future of V2X working group evaluated numerous V2X applications based on a number of items, including spectrum requirements, stakeholder priority, and likely safety benefit. Spectrum requirements were calculated based on assumptions about the number of vehicles within communication range, packet size, repetition rate, activity factors, spectral efficiency, and channel utilization. Next slide. Stakeholder priority was assessed through both informal discussion and a limited survey of IOO priorities for applications. Certainly, this is one of the areas in which we will seek additional information as we move forward with refining the application map and continuing this conversation within the transportation industry. Likely safety benefit was assessed through, again, informal discussion among members in the group, and also NHTSA's Vehicle Safety Communications Project final report. Next slide. The Future of V2X Working Group developed a preliminary application map that attempts to show what message types and applications are likely to be deployed and which are not likely to be deployed. I would note the application map is not final or conclusive. It's intended to be a starting point for the discussions within the transportation industry and conversations about how to build consensus on how to use the 30 megahertz should the FCC continue and finalize its proposal on reallocation. Next slide. Some of the results of our evaluation are listed here. We basically evaluated message types and the spectrum usage and tried to identify which messages could potentially fit in a limited spectrum environment. And we found that a number of messages are likely to fit, including basic safety message, intersection mapping, signal phase and timing, road safety message, signal request, signal status, correction messages, and probe vehicle data. We also found a number of message types that are likely to be lost, such as collective perception messages, maneuver coordination messages, and personal safety messages. I think these messages are particularly important as we look to the more advanced applications. As Shaylin mentioned, these are important for automated vehicles, for sharing information developed from other sensors within a vehicle, such as radar and LiDAR and the like. There are caveats and limitations with this application map. Again, it's a preliminary application map intended to start a conversation in the industry. Our message types and applications were based on existing applications with developed standards, in addition to anticipated applications with standards that are currently in development. We also looked at existing and anticipated methods of deployment and included some of the factors that our members have learned from actually deploying applications in the field. Additionally, while we have a list of messages and applications that we think are likely to be deployed and those that we think are unlikely to be deployed, applications could move between the lists. Message type used and the method of deployment will affect this, as well as changes to application standards and results from the actual deployment in such a scenario with a limited spectrum environment. Next slide. The next 4 slides are pulled from the chart showing applications and message types that are likely and unlikely to be deployed. I would caveat that some of these applications that are in the unlikely to be deployed category could potentially be accomplished through messages instead of, for instance, a CPM message could be accomplished through a BSM and SPAT message. And therefore, they might be able to move over into this side of the chart. Additionally, I would note that, again, you can see the V2X applications are listed. They're in order of our infrastructure owner operator priority list, and that is in column 2. We have also identified a safety priority number and the messages used. Next slide. So this is go back one. This is the second half of the message types and applications that we think would be likely to operate. I would note another caveat. While messages, DSMs, TIMs, maps, SPAT, other messages we think could fit, different applications take vastly different amounts of spectrum, but use the same message type. So just because an application is using a BSM or a TIM, that doesn't mean that it has the same spectral need or requirements as some of the other applications. And this is dependent in part on the sizes of the packets, how frequently the communications need to be made, and the number of vehicles in the area and the number of applications that are running in any given time. So we will dig into that a little bit more, but wanted to put that out there as well. Next slide. So this slide and the following one are applications that we've identified as unlikely to be deployed. Again, one of the examples of an application that could potentially be deployed using different messages is intersection collision warning. So currently it is on our unlikely to be deployed list. But if it was pursued with BSM and SPAT, then you could envision a scenario in which it would fit into a 30 megahertz scenario. Next slide. And again, these are ordered by infrastructure owner operator priority and safety priority. Next slide. And I wanted to give another caveat. All of this is based on having 30 megahertz of spectrum that's unencumbered by interference from out-of-band emissions. So we actually do expect, based on the FCC's current proposal and the power limits, both for indoor unlicensed devices that are included in the final report and order, as those devices will begin to operate on the effective date of the report and order, and the power limits for outdoor unlicensed devices, which are proposed but won't be, are still a subject of the FNPRM, could significantly impact the remaining 30 megahertz with interference. And this is true both of the lower 45 megahertz, and there's concern that out-of-band emissions could be coming down from the 6 gigahertz band in a similar way. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to advocate that appropriate measures are put in place to mitigate this interference. Next slide. As I mentioned a couple times, this is a preliminary application map. There's a number of next steps that we need to take, a number of additional questions, some of which we've already heard or we have come up with that we haven't yet answered. And we know that there are a lot of steps, but we wanted to put this initial preliminary application map out there and present it so that we can start to get feedback and get more input from a broader set of transportation stakeholders. Some of the next steps that we've identified are to run simulations and to evaluate the assumptions that we've used in creating the preliminary application map, to refine the prioritization of applications based on additional IOO input, as well as refining the expected safety benefit calculation, and to incorporate additional feedback from transportation stakeholders, like everyone that's, I think, attending this webinar today. And we know that there are additional questions, right? So how should a channel 180, which is the lower 10 megahertz of the upper 30 megahertz, be best used to provide V2X functionality? If CV2X is operating in the upper 20 megahertz, is there, with safety applications, is there an opportunity to provide some services in the 10 megahertz portion, channel 180, that might be a little bit more tolerant to interference, or might be able to run when the possibility of interference is a little bit higher? Another good question is, how should other critical service needs be provided? So certificate top-off, certificate revocation lists, misbehavior detection and reporting, device management. And I think you'll hear from some of our presenters on ways that we might be able to provide those services, not through short-range radio communications. But again, these are questions that we really need to look into. Some of the other questions I would just add, I think, a prioritization. We did work to try to prioritize applications based on infrastructure owner-operator input and based on expected safety benefit. But if there's a scenario in which you can't fit all of these applications into 30 megahertz, do we need to establish a prioritization scheme that identifies which applications would fall off and which would be prioritized? I would finally note, I think that there's some hopeful information in this application map. I think certainly many of us in the transportation industry just want to be able to deploy this technology and save lives. So I think that, that there's some good here, but also there's some bad. I think that we will lose some of the more advanced message types and applications, and those really are critical as we're looking forward to the broad deployment of automated vehicles, and how do we coordinate movement among automated vehicles. And how do we use all of the sensors on a vehicle and all of the information available to really maximize the safety benefits. And again, the vulnerable road users, bicyclists and pedestrians. it's hard to see a scenario in which personal safety messages are included in a 30 megahertz environment. Next slide. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Mark Mellinger from Cisco to provide a little bit more background on the calculations we made and how we came up with the applications and the map.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, that was an excellent summary. So I think a lot of what you guys will see in the map building we've covered already through Tim's list. We did have a lot of different discussions around which applications be included, where would we get those from. I just kind of wanted to show how the map list was built, some of what we were looking at as far as those calculations. So we'll go through that very, very quickly. The application list, of course, is supposed to be across technology. So we have both DSRC and C-V2X, which have been released and have standards available with them. We wanted to make sure that the applications were not technology centric. So we did our best to pull back from the technologies and just evaluate based on applications. We did look at the existing message types from the J2735 standard that supports both DSRC and C-V2X. We did not pull from ETSI and the European Consortium for any of their message types at this point, although we do see a lot of standards work on what ETSI has developed that may bring us new message types. So that's kind of where we went. Live deployments were very important in our considerations. We made sure that we looked at what had been deployed, which applications have been deployed where, and much of the data that you'll see comes from that. And the application list really is supposed to be comprehensive from everything that's been created by the NHTSA and ARC-IT system. So you should see a full application list. Some we found were redundant. We tried to pull out redundant ones where we could, but we wanted it to be complete. So we wanted you to be able to see that. If I get the next slide, please. So how do we really look at this? You know, there's some Qualcomm and a lot of the other standards bodies out there have some really good calculations that we brought. So we've got a formula that we used around packet size, the number of vehicles, repetition rate, the activity factor, and of course, what we wanted to evaluate when we looked at this data is what would it look like at scale? Right now, as everybody knows, there's very few deployments of connected vehicles in OEMs and very little actual real world data out there. So if we did our calculations right now, we could fit everything in the world in 10 megahertz, which is a lot of what we've been using in DSRC is just that bottom 172, channel 172. But what we're looking at is as we drive forward, that won't be sustainable. So we want to really be evaluating applications across the spectrum requirements, not across the technology again. So we use this in order to do that. We absolutely pulled actual packet captures from real data. So when you look at message sizes and things of that nature, know that that's an average of what we see in actual deployments. And then again, vehicle densities was very important when we looked at a very urban area versus a very rural area. It was important for us to understand how the spectrum requirements changed. And of course, if you're on a really urban area, you know, you get fewer applications because of the amount of messages that are in the air. And I think that John Kenny and Jim will be talking about that as we move forward and how we can address that. So the next slide, if you would. So this is just a very quick example. We were basically using, we split up each of the technologies. So DSRC, C-V2X with HARC, C-V2X without HARC. And then we looked at you know, what that would look like in a small, medium, and high density areas. And so we did calculations based on how many of each message type would fit, what those sizes were, and then started to look at the amount of actual spectrum usage it would take. And so as we looked at that, we really could kind of compare when we fit an application in, how much did that increase a particular message type, which increased the spectrum usage. So I just put this up as a quick example, but it does show that there was a lot of iterations that we went through to get to a point where we could really see if an application would fit and what the scenario was that it would fit in. So this is something that could be debated quite a bit, and we had some really lively discussions on it, but I think it's a really interesting thing to see in how one application used in different scenarios with different densities can really chew up spectrum. So it was very informative for us. Next slide, please. So the priorities, I think Tim went over this very, very well. I think that another thing that I didn't hear yet was just what was the OEM adoption rate going to be when we went with a particular application, not necessarily a technology, but an application? Because I think a lot of what we haven't seen in implementations is the OEMs actually pick this up and run with an application they could deliver to their consumers. And that is very important. It's something that we'll continue to push on. But I think by getting very specific on the applications that are available and can be used, that we can see OEMs adopt those and ultimately see a larger deployment. So that was really one of the things that I wanted to hit. And I think it's my last slide, if you don't mind. One more. Caveats. We went over a lot of this. It's really easy in these type of discussions to say, hey, we can do this better if we did X, Y, and Z. But what we tried to work with the application map was what was real, what was deployed, what are the current message types and implementations that we have to work with. I think that what we are doing in SAE, what the standards bodies as a whole are doing, what the OEMs are doing is just amazing on making these applications work in better ways. You're going to see a lot of that coming up in the next two sections. But we really tried to concentrate on what we had right now, what was deliverable right now, and what message types we had. So I think the new developments are exciting, and hopefully the next two presenters will give you that. We did not also, another big caveat was some of the spectrum in DSRC is utilized for over-the-air updates or certificate management services. We did not do any of that. We considered that to be a separate application altogether, which was not considered in the application map. Many people would debate why that is. Really, it's a service that can be delivered out of band of a safety application typically, and so may not be necessary to be delivered from the intersection itself or from the roadside itself, and potentially could be delivered through things like cellular or wireless. So that was the last caveat, and really appreciate the opportunity to work on this. It's really an important topic that we have to hit, and great to be a part of it. So I'm going to send it back to Tim, who gave such a great outline earlier, but thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I would note there are a number of questions about whether the PowerPoint will be made available. We are going to make the recording available. I imagine the PowerPoint will come with that. I would also note that we are going to release a narrative document that includes the chart that was incorporated into the PowerPoint earlier, as well as a description of the process and some of the items that I went over. So we will be on the lookout for that. And with that, I will hand it over to Jim Meisner with Qualcomm.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Mark, for setting the stage for my short segment, which the title sums it up as it should. Today, how to fit applications into one channel, which is CV2X, and tomorrow, toward addressing advanced applications. So Rachel, if you can go to the next slide, please. So one thing to look at is a cup half full or a cup half empty. And so we've talked both figuratively and really about the green, the safety use cases that could be enabled with the lower 30 megahertz with CV2X. Certainly, we anticipate and look forward aspirationally to these advanced use cases. And as an industry and with stakeholders, we're working to make that real. But for now, let's focus on the green part and how you do CV2X with what we call release 14 or release 15 side link. And side link is direct communication vis-a-vis up or down link. And we can talk as time progresses as to how one would transition into these advanced use cases using the 5G variant. But let's start again with the left and continue, Rachel, please. Next slide. So I want to emphasize that, so we have something called, there's an alphanumeric sequence here, J3161. That's not so as important as to say there are about 60 of us in the standards committee, which I chair, which realized quickly that we need to come to some sort of a head in understanding how you would utilize perhaps 120 megahertz channel or 120 megahertz channel plus 110 megahertz channel to deliver messages. And ultimately, in the end, it's the stakeholder or the deployer that matters. So we weren't too descriptive, but we are coming up with, and this has already gone through and passed first ballots in the comment resolution phase, a way or a framework of how one would use CV2X. Before I go into the 7 categories, which by now you've probably read, but I'll belabor that in a second. Let me just focus on that 120 megahertz radio. Just as an initial deployment point of view, and certainly we can talk about that. Now, the way that we've constructed how CV2X works is that it's a multivariate optimization problem. We looked at not just spectral efficiency, but packet delivery reliability and range. And they go hand in glove, and there's a lot of detail, but just suffice it to say that when we developed collectively the radio access technology, we were very aware of the eventuality, which is happening, that it gets standardized at the application protocol level. Then we also looked at deployability, because with one radio, if you can do many things, it's more likely to be in your car if it's connected to LTE. So there is, when we think about applications, you have to think short and long range, but you want safety and these critical I to V, V to I messages to be delivered. So one way to construct it, and as we're working in the standard, is you divide it into 7 what we call traffic families. And you can read the titles, and what's paramount is the critical V to V. And I've given examples. I know that just prior to this, you saw a really nice table that had messages mapped to what would be on the table and what would be off the table. That is off this 20 or 30 megahertz table. But what we're trying to do here is saying, well, what has to always be on the table is a critical V to V. Now, the other messages, well, granted, ebb and flow in terms of whether they can use what spectrum is available, depending on densities, that is, density of messages. That is, if we're all in the same room at once yelling, the person that yells the loudest is the person that matters. So we want to make sure that critical V to V is what happens, and the other things are prioritized out of this. So this whole idea of a non-prescriptive way of dividing traffic classes, but giving high category to classes, and then having examples, but not saying which can go on. For example, the signal status message and signal request messages are very important to some stakeholders. They might not want to have a second radio for that. So in that particular case, in the implementation in the vicinity, or as the community practitioners eventually get to, that might fall into one of the higher categories. One thing before I go off this slide is that the lower 10 megahertz is not explicitly addressed, although it could be in this framework. That in the concept could be a second radio, and that's an opportunity as well. In some implementations, you may want that to be something for transit signal priority, or better yet, a preemption. Or you could use it for platooning, noting that platooning may happen on highways where there's less likely a chance of the lower 20 megahertz being too crowded and leaking over to the 10 megahertz. Or there's less of a chance for Uni 4 or Wi-Fi interference to happen if indeed outdoor operations are allowed. So go to the next slide, please. So this is actually a snippet, and it may be arcane to some, but what's important here is the message that the safety services on the left kind of decrease, at least in concept, in this frame that we're building, from critical V to V to what we call background, and I've given some examples earlier. And then we have other tools. I mean, certainly we have something called the PROSE, per packet priority, which is quite a mouthful and very alliterative, I guess, in standards. But the idea here is that that's one tool. It's in the toolbox. But there are others which we and SAE, or the committee of 60 experts from across industries, have voted on, which include ideas of a packet delay budget to make sure it comes through, and a concept of congestion. So it looks for the channel, sees what the occupancy ratio is, how crowded it is. And if it's really crowded, we will make even more sure using that knob to make sure that the critical, or try to assure, certainly there are no guarantees in radio communications, that the critical BSM comes through over all the others, because we view that as preeminent. So there is a flux, literally and figuratively, as to what could happen and what may not happen in the way that we're conceiving these applications. And as we're stating yet again, almost as an underscore, that this is rapidly achieving consensus within the standards. And of course, it would be adopted as almost all SAE international standards as an industry standard. So again, there are a bunch of us who are working to try to provide the practitioner with basically a fabric on which to deploy CV2X and 20 megahertz and eventually and 30 megahertz. So one last slide, and perhaps a quick but hopefully illustrative example. A set of slides. This is the pretty picture slide, but hopefully the picture will be something that would be realized, is that we believe that safety can be realized with CV2X and trying to put teeth to it with the standards. And certainly it is contingent on the standards that are nearing completion. And for us, road safety is an important motivation. Going back to the very first slide where I talk about aspirations, certainly there's a difficult evolution and it's something we should tackle, but we can tackle this while we are deploying these basic safety and additional mobility services within the spectrum that we're given. So with that, I'm done until the question and answer time. And again, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jim. And now I will turn it over to John Kinney from Toyota. John, I think you're on mute.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me now. Thanks. I'm glad to be part of this group and have a chance to share with you some perspectives that I hope will be complementary to what you're hearing from the others today. I just want to start by saying I'm a technologist, and I believe that if we're going to realize our goal of mass V2X deployment, we have to understand what our technologies can and cannot do. And we also have to work to build consensus about what it is we want to do together. So that's kind of my starting point. And with that in mind, when we talk about these application maps to the 30 megahertz, you can start with a blank piece of paper and build up. Or what I find myself doing is leveraging and wanting to leverage the work and the long discussions that have happened in our industry over the years already. And so what you see on this first slide here is we're showing the prior 75 megahertz band and a snippet from a standard J2945 that represents an industry consensus on how we were going to use that band, and in particular how we would plan to use channel 172, the most important channel in that plan. And what you see there on the right there in red are the basic safety message is a key message for that channel, and we know that it can consume most of that channel in high vehicle density environments. And we see several other key messages that are relatively lower users of the bandwidth, from mostly I to V, the SPAT and the MAP, the RTCM, RSM. Tim mentioned some of these already. So this is kind of a starting point that was the result of a lot of industry discussion and hashing out what would we put in this most important channel. And if I can ask you to go to the next slide. The reason that I start there is that as we now think about the 30 megahertz, and in particular the upper 20 megahertz, and I'm kind of with Jim that I think that's where our focus needs to be. And if we recognize that for technical reasons, the capacity of that 20 megahertz channel to support applications is approximately the same as channel 172 in the DSRC scheme, we recognize that channel 183 is essentially the new channel 172, and that core set of applications that we agreed would be the 172 applications become the core set of applications in this channel 183 thinking as well. So that's kind of my starting point, and I hope that resonates with some of you who also have been part of this community for a while, maybe, and are familiar with our thinking about channel 172. I know that it was helpful for me. I also find myself, when we're asking this question about what fits in, what messages fit in a channel, I find myself coming back to the analogy frequently of what fits in a suitcase when we're packing a suitcase. And so with that in mind, and if we could go to the next slide, maybe the first question is, can we adopt if it fits, it ships kind of a model like we see in the shipping industry? And I'd like to argue that no, we really shouldn't be thinking of it that way. And the reason is that our messages are not like t-shirts and and socks. Our messages are fragile things, and so if we're thinking about packing messages into a channel, it's more like packing something like eggs that are fragile into a suitcase. And I know that's a bit of a twist on an analogy, and I hope it stays with you. And the lesson here is that if we pack eggs in a suitcase prudentially, we can put a lot of eggs in the suitcase and everything will be fine. But if we get overly aggressive, we could put as many eggs into a suitcase as you want, but they're going to cram into each other and they're going to damage each other. And eventually we're going to end up with really nothing useful coming out at the other end. So if we think of this whole question of what fits in the channel as a little bit analogous to kind of the strange analogy of packing eggs into a suitcase, the message is we should resist the temptation to overpack. Next slide, please. Another perspective on this is that, as Tim mentioned, not all applications are created equal with respect to how much bandwidth they need. We have some, like the basic safety message, that can consume a lot of bandwidth because in dense vehicle environments with every vehicle sending BSMs, they can chew up a lot of a channel. We have others, and quite a few of the others, that are typically coming from roadside units, and they're not so densely deployed, and they're not consuming so much bandwidth. So one way to think about filling up a channel with applications and messages is to try to balance between the large consumers and the small consumers. And if we go to the next slide, please. What we realize is that there are some other large consumers or potentially large consumers of spectrum that probably are not going to fit in that channel. So as we struggled with this question of what would fit, we struck a balance between essentially one large consumer, the basic safety message that we all agreed is something that we cannot do without, and several small users of the bandwidth. And we see some of them listed there, and there's potentially others that the developing consensus process will emerge. But there are, unfortunately, some really important classes that probably there's not enough room for. Next slide, please. Another perspective I wanted to share is that we shouldn't think of this exercise that we're doing as creating a legal list of prohibited messages. It's not like that. The fact is that the FCC is very unlikely to include in their rules details about message types and applications. And even if the US DOT wanted to do that, they probably don't have the authority to do that. So we're not talking about legal prohibitions. Instead, we're talking about developing an industry consensus. And this webinar and this effort of this group is really the first step in developing that. But we're going to need some more steps, and we're going to need more technical work to really solidify this. Now, if we can get that industry consensus, that doesn't mean that we're going to stop somebody from doing what I call a rogue deployment and operating outside of the plan. But at least if the major deployment stakeholders can have the discipline to stick with a plan, then we can also have confidence that the performance is going to be there that we need to justify our deployment of safety critical systems. And we need our customers to be able to depend on the systems we deploy, and we need to be able to rely on some assumptions when we do that. Next slide, please. So the last point I wanted to make is that as we approach this question of packet channel 183, it's tempting to think about using priority schemes to help us pack more things in. But I just want to offer a caution about that. I think that the mechanism that we have from the 3GPP standards is a relatively blunt instrument, and I have concerns about how well it can work. So what does this PPPP thing do? Well, what it does is it sets a limit on the amount of airtime that a specific application priority class can occupy on a per device basis. So, and that can be as a function of, for example, how busy the channel is. You can dial that back. If the channel is busier, you can reduce the amount of airtime for the class. The reason that that's difficult is that our environment is one in which the number of devices can vary wildly by hundreds. and that makes it hard to find effective limits. So I'll just give you a quick example here. Let's say that we decided that a particular low priority class of applications would have a low limit of 0.1% of airtime per device. That means that any device could only transmit for 1 millisecond out of every second in this low application priority class in order to protect the higher priority applications. Well, if we're operating in an environment where there's only 10 such vehicles that want to use that class, then they're collectively only going to use 1% of the channel, and that's great. That's a good outcome. But imagine another case where we have 500 vehicles that want to use that priority class. Each one at 1/10 of 1% means that collectively they're going to fill up 50% of the channel with that traffic. That's a lot of eggs going into an already pretty full suitcase. And it's going to crowd out the BSMs, and it's going to harm the performance. And that's what we absolutely cannot afford to do. So as a means of protecting the high priority traffic, this priority mechanism is, as I say, a relatively blunt instrument. And my conclusion is that we should be conservative, not overly aggressive about allowing low priority applications to use channel 183. And with that, I'm finished. Now I'll turn it back to you, Tim. Thanks.
Thanks, John, and thank you, Jim and Mark, for your presentations as well. And I would invite all of you to come back on video for the questions session. I think one point I want to make is there's a lot of perspectives at ITS America, and we tried to incorporate those perspectives in our Future of V2X working group, whether that's on the infrastructure owner operator or OEM side, or whether that's different perspectives on the best technology to use going forward. So we're not always going to agree on every aspect, but we felt it was important to come together and begin the conversation, and so we can start having those hard discussions related to all aspects of how we move forward with V2X deployment. We've received a number of questions. So I'm going to take a couple of those, and we'll also ask my co-presenters to chime in as well. I want to start with, there's some questions regarding the FCC and whether a change in leadership with the new administration impacts the possibility that the FCC wouldn't move forward with its proposal. The first thing I would note is that the votes at the FCC have been unanimous to move forward with reallocation. This goes back to December 2019. The two democratically appointed and 3 Republican appointed commissioners. There is a little bit of a different makeup at the commission now. We will have a new chair of the FCC, and that will be appointed by President Biden. So we're likely to see 3 democratically appointed commissioners and 2 Republicans. But I don't know that that changes the FCC calculus at all. Certainly, it interjects some opportunity to influence the FCC. I know that at ITS America, we certainly are interested in opportunities to prevent the reallocation of the lower 45 megahertz. Our focus is on trying to secure enough spectrum for V2X technologies to move forward. I would also note that the executive order the president signed the other day halting regulatory activity for 60 days likely doesn't apply specifically to the FCC because it's an independent agency and not directly under the executive branch. However, they may decide to follow the regulatory freeze in a moment of comedy with the White House and the new administration. I think that's still to be seen. I would also note that I think, as you know, there's also a new Congress, right? There's a new Democratic control of the Senate, but they're similarly to how eager we in the transportation industry are to protect the spectrum and use it for V2X technologies. There are interests on the other side who are very eager to open it up for unlicensed device use. So I think that the main scope of the landscape has not shifted significantly at this point. There was a question on what is infrastructure owner operator priority. we had, through discussion with our IOOs that were included in the working group, and through a survey that we had them complete, where they listed their priority for individual applications, is how we came up with that. Certainly, I think we need to involve more perspectives and viewpoints from infrastructure owner operators. Part of that, another question I saw was how do we address OEM priority? I think this, again, was part of the process in our informal discussions. We didn't do a survey. I think that some of the OEM priority is probably represented through those working group discussions, and that some of it is contingent on the infrastructure owner operators as well, at least apart from the V2V application. Certainly on the infrastructure side, it's important to get both groups working together. I would ask John, Kenny, if you have any additional thoughts on how, whether and how we can incorporate OEM priority.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think that is an important question because so far we haven't exactly seen automakers beating down the door to deploy the equipment, and I think we're all going through rationalization exercises to try to figure out what benefits our customers can realize from this. So I think maybe in a survey like we've done on the IO side of the OEMs might be appropriate, especially to try to gauge what additional services beyond kind of the core safety services might particular OEMs see as really key to being able to move into that deployment phase.
Thanks, John. And another question that we received was on prioritization. I think we answered this a little bit. It was, how do you ensure that everybody is sticking with the same prioritization scheme? And I think you can tell there is some difference of opinion within the working group on the prioritization. Jim, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to your view on that.
Sure, I do. Thank you. I don't want to make it a point counterpoint because John and I both agree that we have a suitcase of eggs. But how good is that PPP tool, and what other tools are available? Are questions that are being debated in the community, and what sides we come on. But what's important to note is that irrespective of the radio access technology, prioritization with channel congestion is an issue. If you have a listen before you talk scheme a la DSRC, you have a problem too. When there's too many, you may not get channel access. So but to generalize it, it is always a problem. And what this discussion does is brings to a head that as a community with limited or scarce resources, we have to figure out what to put into that suitcase, and maybe we should boil the eggs first.
That's one idea for sure.
A small thing is that some OEMs have made the commitment for V2X. We can talk offshore, but we can certainly talk in the U.S. There's been an announcement by a major OEM that there would be V2X in the U.S. So and certainly others are considering it. But let's just call this V2X and the applications that are attractive, and I think that resonates with all communities.
So Tim, I saw one question I'd like to bring up just to get some clarity. One of the questions was, wouldn't it make more sense for OEMs to focus on V2V safety apps? And I think it's very important as a general rule that we understand that the same messages that we're using for the infrastructure safety applications are the ones that they use for V2V. So, if we utilize the spectrum for these message types, they're used for V2V as well as V2I. So I think that's really important distinction there. You can't do V2V without these messages and that spectrum at this point.
Thanks, Mark. I also saw a question regarding potential spectrum interference, and it's a little bit apart from this application map, but I will take a stab at it. I know that during the comment and reply comment process, the MPRM, USDOT, and I believe Ford and CAMP had all put out information on expected interference. I don't know that I've seen any since the vote in November, but again, I think it's one of the areas that it's not conclusive yet, and I think that the FCC hasn't shown that it can protect the spectrum and we have serious concerns going forward regarding interference. We also have questions, I think, about the various individual aspects that were included in our application map. And I wanted to note, in addition to posting the recording of this webinar and the slide deck, again, we are going to release a short, I think, 7-page narrative document that discusses many of these issues and includes the chart that you saw earlier. And I'm hopeful that that will answer some of the questions that you all have. And I think, as we seek to move forward, we're certainly looking for researchers and academics who can help us run simulations and test some of our assumptions and really drill down a little bit more into the specifics, doing a rigorous kind of analysis of where we are today. And we're certainly going to work hand in hand with them and show, what we based our calculations on and what we think we need going forward. Additionally, I think we will convene more conversations, right? I think that, what we really heard today, in my mind, is that we do need a consensus. We need the industry to move forward together and figure out the best way to use the spectrum. Maybe need is a little too strong there. Maybe it's just I want to build consensus in the industry, but I certainly am looking forward to working with all stakeholders across the board in further refining the application map. And I guess I would provide the opportunity, Jim, Mark, or John. We only have a couple minutes here left. Are there any final remarks that you would have, or anything that you think we missed today?
Tim, thanks for the opportunity for a quick closing summary. I just want to reiterate what you said about the need for more work, more technical work on these questions. We've done, I think, a good starting job in the analytical side of things, but the reality is that the complicated interaction when you start putting packets in channels is something that really requires good simulation. And so for the research community out there, I would encourage you to look to help us with that. We need to understand what can fit and still provide the benefits that we need without degrading them.
I'm in agreement.
Go ahead, Jim.
Coming from the research community many years ago, I 100% agreement that research has a place here. So does deployment, and the two could and should work hand in glove. And looking forward to this journey together.
I think I'd like to say one thing too. I think when we look at the standards bodies that are working on this, absent sometimes of the IOO and a lot of the owner operator inputs. So, participation, I think, is critical in standards at all levels. And so SAE, Jim runs a great committee there, and there's some other applications that are being utilized and worked right now at the SAE level that would really benefit from more input. So the participation in the organizations all the way through, I think would really benefit everybody for this. So thanks for the time, Tim.
Thank you. And just want to say again, thank you to our presenters today, Jim, Mark, and John, and all the work that the members of the Future of V2X Working Group have put in over the last several months on this issue. We're going to continue to work to refine the application map and try to build consensus among the industry. And in addition, we're going to continue to try to protect the 5.9 gigahertz band, and that includes protecting the upper 30 megahertz from interference, and we would be hopeful that the lower 45 megahertz would not be reallocated at all, would instead be continued to be preserved for V2X technologies. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time, and we will follow up with the recording and the presentation and other documents as they're available on our website. So thank you, everybody.